The scream came from the second floor at exactly 6:43 in the evening, followed by the unmistakable sound of a soup tureen shattering against imported Italian marble. The nanny, a woman with 15 years of experience and a resume that could paper a wall, ran down the grand staircase with mashed potatoes in her hair and tears streaking her mascara. She did not stop to gather her coat. She did not stop to collect her final paycheck. She only paused at the front door long enough to look at the man standing at the base of the stairs, a man in a charcoal suit, whose face betrayed nothing, and to say 6 trembling words. "I quit. I am so sorry." That was the 27th nanny in 18 months. Adrian Vale watched the door close behind her with the same expression he wore during hostile takeovers, board meetings, and the funerals of his enemies. Nothing. He felt nothing on his face, and everything underneath it, somewhere above him. On the second floor of his 12,000-square-foot penthouse. 4 small voices were laughing. They were laughing. He climbed the stairs, slowly, one hand loosening the black silk tie at his throat, and when he reached the dining room he saw the damage. The soup was on the wall. The wall was oyster-white silk wallpaper imported from Kyoto. The soup had been butternut squash. On the long walnut table, 4 children sat in various states of guilt. The twins, Owen and Otto, both 6 years old, were staring at their laps. Their older sister Isla, who was 9 and who had somehow managed to gain command of every household staff member she had ever met, was chewing a bread roll with the calm of a general reviewing a battlefield. And at the head of the table, the youngest, 4-year-old Poppy, was crying quietly into the sleeve of her nightgown, because the noise had frightened her. Adrian looked at them. They looked at him. Silence. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. His voice was already the loudest thing in any room, without ever needing to climb above a murmur. "Who threw it?" he asked. Nobody answered, which was, he supposed, an answer. Downstairs, in the study lined with first editions and burro walnut paneling, his oldest friend and consigliere, a man named Marco Bianchi, who had worn a suit every day since he was 19 years old, was already pouring 2 glasses of scotch. He heard Adrian's footsteps and did not look up. 27, Marco said, sliding 1 glass across the desk. "You are a man who owns 3 shipping fleets, 4 private banks, and a controlling interest in the world's second-largest telecommunications company. Yet you cannot keep a single nanny past a soup course." "The children do not like being handled," Adrian said. "The children," Marco said, taking a long sip, "are running a small guerrilla operation out of the East Wing. Yesterday I saw Isla teaching Poppy how to short-sheet a bed. I mean, actually, short-sheet a bed. Where does a 9-year-old learn that?" Adrian did not answer. He looked out the window at the dark span of the city below, and thought of his wife, Elena, who had been gone now for 2.5 years. He thought of the way she had laughed. She had been the one who kept the noise inside the house from becoming chaos. Now, the noise was chaos, and he did not know how to be a father to grief-shaped children when he himself was only a grief-shaped man in an expensive suit. Marco set down his glass. "There is 1 name left on the agency list," he said. 1. "If she does not last, we are officially banned from every reputable childcare firm in the tri-state area." "Send her," Adrian said. "Do you not want to know her name?" "No." "She has no glowing references," Marco said. "The agency admits it. Her regular work is at a small bakery on 5th and Halsted. She only takes childcare jobs when they cannot fill a slot, and Adrian, they cannot fill this slot." "Send her," Adrian said, again. Marco allowed himself 1 small smile. "As you wish." The next morning, at 7:12, exactly, the doorbell rang. Margaret Rowe stood on the marble steps of the largest private residence she had ever seen in her 31 years of life, and she pressed the doorbell with a hand that was trembling, for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. Behind her, the taxi pulled away, because the fare had already been paid. In front of her, the door was carved oak, set with brass fittings that were older than her grandmother. Margaret was 5'4", and as she often said, with a small, self-deprecating shrug that she had learned to perform since she was 14. She was built for comfort, not for speed. She was a large woman. She had a soft, round face with a warm, dimpled chin, full arms that had spent years lifting 50-pound bags of flour, a wide, generous torso, a full bust, and hips that filled the plain navy blue dress she had chosen because it was the most respectable thing she owned. Her hair was chestnut brown and tied back in a low bun. She wore no makeup because she did not have the time to learn how, and her only jewelry was a small silver pendant her mother had left her. She looked at her reflection in the brass fittings and drew a breath. "You can do this, Margaret," she whispered. "It is just a job. It is just breakfast. It is just children." The door opened. The man who stood in the doorway was not a servant. Servants, in her limited experience, did not radiate that particular quiet. He was tall. He was impossibly tall. He wore a charcoal suit with no tie, and his shirt collar was open at the throat. His hair was black and cut short. His jaw was sharp enough to draw a line with, and his eyes, when they met hers, were the pale steel gray of a winter sea. He was, she thought, possibly the most handsome man she had ever seen in real life, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not read. "Miss Rowe," he said. "Yes," she said. "Yes. Sorry, that is me. I am so sorry, I was just the door." "And I Adrian Vale," he said, and did not offer his hand. "Come in." She stepped inside. The foyer alone was larger than her entire studio apartment. There was a chandelier. There was a real chandelier, made of what looked like actual glass, hanging above her head at a height that suggested it might have been designed by someone who had never once worried about earthquakes. He led her down a hall. He said nothing. She followed him and tried very hard not to gawk. But there were oil paintings on the walls that she was fairly sure she had seen in textbooks. At the end of the hall he stopped. "Through this door," he said, "are my 4 children. Their names are Isla, Owen, Otto, and Poppy. They are 9, 6, 6, and 4. In the last 18 months they have gone through 27 child care professionals. Do you understand what I am telling you?" Margaret blinked up at him. She was quite short next to him. She had to tilt her chin up. "You are telling me," she said carefully, "that they are unhappy." Something flickered in his eyes. It was there, and then it was gone. "That is one interpretation," he said. "Have you asked them why?" she said. And then she flushed. "I am sorry, that was not my business." "Well then, I only meant, sometimes children act out because there is a thing they are trying to say but cannot say. I have 4 younger cousins. My aunt used to say, the loudest child in the room is usually the one who is trying hardest to be heard." Adrian Vale looked at her for a long moment. Then he opened the door. The 4 children were seated at a smaller breakfast table in a bright morning room with a view of the terraced garden. They looked up when the door opened. Margaret saw the exact instant that 4 small pairs of eyes swept over her, took in her size, and calculated. She knew that calculation. She had known it since she was 8 years old. She braced herself, but she did not turn away. Pot. She did not shrink. Instead, she smiled. The same wide, warm smile she gave to the 8-year-olds who came to the bakery with their allowance clutched in their fists, trying to buy their mothers a birthday cupcake. "Good morning," she said. "My name is Margaret, but my friends call me Maggie." and I am rubbish at names, so I will need each of you to tell me yours very slowly and very clearly, because if I get them wrong, I am going to feel terrible all day. Isla, the oldest, was the first to speak. She looked Margaret up and down with the appraising eye of a much older woman. "You are fat," she said. "Isla," Adrian said, and his voice, though still level, dropped by exactly 1 degree, which anyone who had ever worked for him would have recognized as thunder. "It is all right," Margaret said quickly without turning. She kept her eyes on Isla. "I am," she said. "I am a large lady." "That is true. Do you know what else is true? I make the best cinnamon rolls in the entire city, and my arms give the warmest hugs, and I have never once fallen off a swing. So there are some real advantages." Isla stared at her, and then, very slowly, the corner of her mouth twitched. The smallest one, Poppy, slid off her chair, walked around the table in her flannel pajamas, and, without speaking a word, reached her small arms up. Margaret bent down and gathered her up as if she had done it 1,000 times, which she had, only with other people's children. Behind her Adrian Vale stood in the doorway and did not move. She stayed. That was the beginning. She stayed through breakfast. She stayed through the twins hiding her handbag inside the piano bench, and she found it while laughing. She stayed through Isla pretending she did not need help with her homework, and she sat quietly next to her anyway, and worked on a crossword puzzle until Isla finally, grudgingly, showed her the fractions. She stayed through Poppy's afternoon meltdown, which she calmed by simply sitting on the floor with the little girl in her lap and humming a song her own mother had once hummed to her. She stayed through dinner. Adrian Vale came home at 7. He climbed the stairs to the second-floor dining room, expecting soup on a wall. Instead, he stopped in the doorway and did not enter. His 4 children were seated at the table. They were eating. They were talking. Isla was laughing at something Owen had said. Poppy was drinking her milk, spilling only a small amount. At the head of the table, in the seat that had once been his wife's, sat a large young woman in a plain navy dress who was quietly cutting Otto's chicken into smaller pieces and murmuring something that made him giggle. Adrian stood in the doorway for a long time. Something in his chest, something that had been clenched for 2.5 years, made a small, unfamiliar movement. Margaret looked up and saw him. "Oh," she said, half rising. "Vale, I did not know. I can go. I am so sorry. I did not mean to." "Sit," he said quietly, and then, after a pause, "Please." She sat. He walked to the far end of the table, took his seat, and unfolded his napkin. "Have you eaten, Miss Rowe?" he asked. "I? No, but I am fine. There is a plate for you," he said, though there had not been a plate for her a moment before, and yet somehow one appeared, carried in by a silent housekeeper who set it down in front of her without comment. "Eat." She ate. The children talked. She listened. Occasionally she answered a question. London. Twice she made Isla laugh out loud, an event that had, according to the housekeeper who reported it to Marco Bianchi the next morning, not occurred in this house since the funeral. Adrian said very little. But his eyes, when Margaret was not looking, watched her over the rim of his water glass with an expression that Marco, had he been present, would have recognized instantly and would have teased him about mercilessly. She stayed the next day, and the next, at the end of the first week. Adrian summoned her to his study. Margaret stood in front of the enormous desk, twisting her hands together in front of her. "You are still here," he said. "Yes, sir." "You did not run." "No, sir." He looked at her for a long moment. "I would like to offer you a permanent position. Live-in. Triple your current salary. Full benefits. A wing of the house." Margaret felt her mouth open. She closed it. She opened it again. "That is very generous," she said. "But I have a job at the bakery. I cannot leave Mrs. Brackshaw. Antonelli, she needs me on the weekend rush. She has arthritis in her hands and, then keep both," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Work at the bakery on your days off. My driver will take you." Margaret stared at him. "Mr. Vale," she said carefully. "Sir, that is, I cannot let you send a driver every day for a bakery shift. That is, Miss Rowe," he said. "The children have not thrown food in 7 days. Do you understand what that is worth?" She swallowed. "Yes, sir," she whispered. "Then it is settled." That was the beginning of her second life. She moved into the East Wing on a Tuesday. The car that came to collect her belongings held them all with room to spare, because everything she owned in the world fit into 2 suitcases and a cardboard box of books. The driver, a broad-shouldered man named Anton, who never smiled, but who always opened the door for her with a formal little bow, drove her belongings to the penthouse and helped her carry them upstairs. Her wing, and she could not stop calling it that in her head, felt ridiculous. My wing, was 3 rooms. A bedroom, the size of her old apartment, a small sitting room with a fireplace. A private bathroom with a soaking tub so large she was afraid of it. That first night she sat on the edge of the enormous bed, in a plain cotton nightgown, and she cried. She did not know why she was crying. It was not sadness. It was something else. It was the feeling of having been carried, gently, across a threshold she had never expected to cross. It was the feeling of a warm plate appearing in front of her. She washed her face. She went to sleep. At 2 in the morning, a small voice at her door said, "Maggie." She opened her eyes. Poppy stood in the doorway in her flannel nightgown, one thumb in her mouth. "Come here, love," Margaret said, and lifted the blankets. Poppy climbed in and fell asleep almost immediately, curled against Margaret's soft, warm side, breathing slowly. In the doorway, unseen, Adrian Vale stood for a full minute before turning and walking silently back to his own room. Weeks passed, then months. The house changed. It changed in ways too small to name at first. A vase of fresh flowers appeared on the breakfast table. Then, too, Isla started leaving her homework on the kitchen counter for Margaret to check. The twins invented a game called Maggie in the Middle, which mostly involved throwing a softball over her head while she pretended to try to catch it. Poppy would not sleep unless Margaret read her a story. Adrian noticed all of it. He noticed how his children now ran, not to their rooms when they heard the front door, but to the kitchen, because Margaret was in the kitchen. He noticed how the housekeeper had started humming. He noticed how Marco, when he came for their weekly meetings, would ask, with a very carefully arranged face, how Miss Rowe was doing. He noticed how Miss Rowe, one evening, laughed at something Poppy said. He noticed that her laugh was low and warm, and made him set down his pen and stare at the paper in front of him for a full 30 seconds, without reading a word of it. He noticed, and he did not say anything. But he began quietly to arrange things. Margaret did not know that the bakery on 5th and Halsted was suddenly, mysteriously, no longer at risk of losing its lease, which had been the case for 6 months. She did not know that Mrs. Crease, Antonelli, who had feared having to close, had received a very generous offer from an anonymous investor to expand into the adjoining storefront. She did not know that her mother's grave, which had gone untended in a small cemetery 2 states away, because Margaret could not afford to travel there often, was now being maintained monthly by a groundskeeper who had received a private arrangement to plant fresh flowers on the 1st of every month. She did not know any of it. She did not know that when she casually mentioned, one evening at dinner, that she had always wanted to see the ocean, A private plane was tentatively rescheduled. The following Monday, for reasons that had nothing to do with business. She did not know. But Marco Bianchi knew. Marco Bianchi knew everything because it was his job to know. And Marco Bianchi one Wednesday afternoon closed the door of Adrian's study behind him, sat down in the leather chair across from the desk, and said, "We need to talk about your nanny." Adrian did not look up from his papers. "She is very good with the children." "She is," Marco said. "She is also the reason you have started coming home before 8 in the evening for the first time in 3 years. She is the reason you smiled. Last Tuesday. I saw it. I have witnesses." Adrian's pen did not stop moving. "Also," Marco continued calmly, "the bakery. The bakery was a good investment. The bakery employs 6 people, and grosses less in a year than you spend on shoes. I like the pastries." Marco laughed. He actually laughed. Threw his head back and laughed at the ceiling. "You, my friend," he said, when he could speak again, "are done for. You are entirely done for. She does not even know." "She does not need to know," Adrian said. "She is happy, the children are happy. That is enough." He looked at his oldest friend for a long time. "Adrian," he said, "that is not enough, not for a man like you. And one day someone is going to come for what is yours. And she does not even know she is yours. And I need you to understand that when that day comes, we will not have time to explain it to her." Adrian set down his pen. That day came sooner than either of them expected. It began, as these things so often did, with a phone call. Marco's phone rang at 11:43 on a Thursday morning, and by 11:45 he was standing in the doorway of Adrian's office, with a face that made Adrian rise slowly from his chair without asking a single question. "Kessler," Marco said. The name landed in the room like a dropped stone. Kessler had been, for 8 years, the shadow at the edge of Adrian's empire. He was the man who had orchestrated the illegal cargo interception 3 years ago that had cost the life of Adrian's wife, though nothing had ever been provable. He was the reason Adrian had 4 children who did not sleep without a light on. He was the reason Adrian's security details had triple layers. And now, apparently, he was moving again. "He has filed a claim," Marco said, walking to the window, keeping his voice low. "Through a shell company. He is claiming that 15 years ago, before you and I even met, your late father illegally seized a piece of property in the Adriatic port zone. He wants it back. And he has somehow produced a witness. A witness. A living witness. One who is prepared to testify." "Who?" Marco hesitated. "Adrian," he said, "this is what worries me. The witness is a woman named Sophia Rowe." Adrian went very still. "Sophia Rowe," Marco said, again watching Adrian carefully, "was Margaret's mother, who died 4 years ago. Officially." The room seemed to tilt. "Kessler is claiming," Marco said, "that she has been in hiding all this time, that she witnessed the seizure, and that she has recently come forward, and Adrian, he is not merely making a legal claim. He is claiming that Margaret is the direct legal heir to a piece of property worth roughly $1.4 billion, and that we have, quote, been sheltering the heir under our roof, in an act of coercion, unquote." Adrian sat down slowly. "He wants Margaret," he said quietly. "He wants the property," Marco said. "Margaret is the leverage, bar. If he can produce a mother who is hidden away by us, or take Margaret and force her signature, the property flips into his shell company, and we are in front of a court trying to prove a negative." Adrian looked at the phone on his desk. He looked at the door, He thought of Margaret, upstairs, at that exact moment, probably braiding Poppy's hair for school pictures. "Where is she now?" he said. "At the school." "She took Poppy for pictures." Adrian stood up. "Black protocol," he said. Marco's face did not change. He nodded once. "Understood." "Every single one," Adrian said. "Now." Black protocol was an arrangement Adrian had put in place after his wife's death. It called for the simultaneous mobilization of every private security element under his employment, the closing of every route in and out of the city that his organization controlled, the sealing of every airport hangar he owned, and the immediate lockdown of every person on a short, precisely maintained list of protected individuals. There were exactly 6 names on that list. 4 of them were his children. 1 of them was Marco. The 6th had been added quietly, 17 weeks ago, without discussion. The name was Margaret Rowe. At the school, at that exact moment, Margaret was standing in the hallway with her hand on Poppy's shoulder, laughing at something the photographer had said when she noticed the 2 men in dark suits at the end of the corridor. She did not know them. They were not the drivers she had come to recognize. They were walking toward her with the kind of purposeful stride that made her stomach go cold. "Miss Rowe," one of them said, as they approached, "we need you to come with us." Margaret's grip on Poppy tightened. "I do not know you," she said. "Mr. Vale sent us," the other said. "There has been a security issue. Please." Something in Margaret, some deep, quiet thing that had been slowly waking up over the last 4 months, said no. Said it clearly, said it loudly. She did not know how she knew. She just did. "I will call him," she said, taking out her phone. "If he sent you, he will confirm." "That will not be necessary," the first man said, and reached for her arm. Poppy screamed. And that was when the school hallway filled with people. 6 men in dark coats came through the front doors of the school. They did not run. They walked in a wedge formation, and in less than 5 seconds they had positioned themselves between Margaret and the 2 strangers. The 2 strangers took one look at the newcomers and turned to leave. They did not make it 3 steps before 2 more men entered through the side doors and cut off their exit. At the center of the wedge, a familiar figure stepped forward. Anton, the driver who never smiled, was smiling now. It was a small, terrible smile. "Miss Rowe," he said very quietly, "Mr. Vale is on the phone. He would like to speak to you." He held out a phone. Margaret took it with a hand that was shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. "Margaret," Adrian's voice said, and she had never in her life heard him say her first name before. And it was the calmest thing she had ever heard. The calmest and yet somehow the most urgent. "Are you hurt?" "No," she whispered. "No, I am not hurt." "Adrian, what is happening? Are the children with you?" "Just Poppy. The others are at school. They are already with my people. Everyone is safe." "Margaret, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I need you to get in the car with Anton. He is going to take you home. There are things I have to tell you that I should have told you months ago. I am sorry. I am so sorry that you are learning them like this." Margaret closed her eyes. She held Poppy tighter. "I will come home," she said. The ride was silent. Poppy fell asleep against her shoulder. Margaret stared out the window at a city she suddenly did not recognize and thought about her mother. Her mother who had died 4 years ago. Her mother whose grave she visited on the anniversary. Her mother whose photograph she kept on her nightstand. Her mother who had, when Margaret was 17 years old, sat her down at their small kitchen table and said, "If anything ever happens to me, promise me you will never sign a paper for anyone you do not trust. Promise me. Even if they say it is mine, even if they say it is yours, Margaret had laughed. "Mama," she had said, "nothing is going to happen to you." She had never understood, until this moment in the back seat of a black car, why her mother had asked. When she arrived at the penthouse, Adrian was standing in the foyer. She had never seen him like this. His tie was gone, his sleeves were rolled up, and his hair was slightly disheveled, as though he had run his hand through it more than once. When he saw her, something in his face broke and reformed in a single motion. He crossed the foyer in 4 long strides. He stopped 1 foot in front of her. "Are you all right?" he said. She nodded, unable to speak. Poor. And then Adrian Vale, the silent king, the man who had never once in her presence made a gesture that was not deliberate, reached out and pulled her, and Poppy in her arms into his chest, and he held them both. He held them without saying anything, and Margaret felt his heartbeat against her cheek, and it was hammering. He had been afraid. He had been afraid for her. She started to cry quietly into the front of his shirt. Then, without letting go of her, he began, very slowly, to speak. He told her everything. Every single thing. He told her about Kessler. He told her about the property. He told her the claim that had been made regarding her mother. And he told her that within the last hour his people had confirmed, through channels she did not want to know about, that a woman matching her mother's description had, in fact, been alive until 3 weeks ago. She had been in hiding, in a small town in Portugal, under Kessler's protection, which had been more accurately Kessler's captivity, since a car accident that had never actually killed her. She had escaped 3 weeks ago. Well, she had been trying to reach Margaret. Kessler had found her before she could. Margaret sat down on the marble floor of the foyer. She sat down because her legs stopped working. Adrian knelt in front of her, still holding her hands. "She is alive," she whispered. She was alive. All this time? Yes. Where is she? Now, Adrian's jaw tightened. "That is what I am going to find out." She looked up at him. And now, for the first time, she asked a question she had never asked before, because she had never let herself see it. "Adrian," she said, "the bakery. Mrs. Antonelli. The grave. The way you always seem to know when I am tired. The way there is always tea when I come downstairs. All of it. How long?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Since the 2nd day," he said quietly. "Since the 2nd day you were in this house." She stared at him. "I did not know how to say it," he said. "I do not know how to say it now. I only knew that when you walked into this house began to breathe again, and I would move mountains, Margaret. I would move any mountain, quietly, so that you would never feel the cold of them. I never expected you to know. I never needed you to know. I only needed you to be safe. And to be here." She lifted her hand and touched his face. "You should have told me," she said softly. "I know. Kessler was not a man who lost." But by 3 in the morning that night, in a warehouse 2 hours outside the city, Adrian Vale stood in a doorway in a black coat and looked at a man who had for a brief moment 8 years earlier believed himself to be Adrian's equal, and who now understood. Kessler had a bruise on his jaw. His 2 lieutenants were seated on the floor, with their hands zip-tied. There had been no gunfire. There had, in fact, been almost no violence at all. What there had been, instead, was the sudden and total collapse of every legal front, every offshore account, every safe route, and every loyal subordinate that Kessler had spent a decade constructing. It had all been quietly dismantled in the course of 6 hours, through phone calls and wire transfers, and the calling in of favors from people whose names would never appear in any newspaper. Adrian stepped into the warehouse. He walked past the lieutenants without looking at them. He stopped in front of Kessler. "Where," he said, "is her mother?" Kessler smiled. It was a bad smile. "Somewhere you will not find her," he said. "Somewhere she does not want to be found. She is a difficult woman, like her daughter." Adrian looked at him for a long moment, then he simply held out his hand. Marco stepped forward and placed a folder in it. Adrian opened the folder. He held it up so that Kessler could see. Inside were photographs, bank records, property deeds, names of Kessler's children, who lived in 3 different countries, under 3 different names, because Kessler had believed himself hidden. He was not hidden. He had never been hidden. "You have," Adrian said softly. "One chance. Tell me where she is, and your family will be left alone. If you do not tell me, everything in this folder will be handed to every intelligence agency in 6 countries by sunrise. Your children will be homeless by breakfast." Kessler's smile faded. He told him. Sophia Rowe was recovered before dawn from a small farmhouse in the Portuguese countryside. She was thin, and she was frightened, and she was, when the door opened and she saw the men who had come for her, ready to fight. But then a woman stepped forward, a woman in a heavy black coat with kind eyes and a warm smile. "Mrs. Rowe," the woman said gently, "my name is Elena. Adrian sent me. I have a phone. Would you like to speak to your daughter?" Sophia Rowe took the phone in shaking hands. "Margaret," she said. "Margaret, my girl, my girl. I am so sorry, I am so sorry." "Mama," Margaret said, and could not say anything else, because she was on the floor of her sitting room clutching the phone to her ear and sobbing. Adrian, sitting beside her, quietly took her free hand in his and did not let go. 6 months later, the bakery on 5th and Halsted had a new sign. It read quite simply, "Sophia and Maggie's," in gold letters. And beneath the sign was a large window, and behind the window were the 2 most popular bakers in the entire city, a mother and daughter who could not seem to stop touching each other's hands as they worked, as if each was afraid the other might disappear. The bakery had a line down the block on the morning it reopened. In the line, though most of the customers did not know it, were people from 4 different security details, dressed as ordinary customers, because Adrian Vale had a very specific policy about the 2 women behind the counter. Isla, Owen, Otto, and Poppy sat at a small table at the front window. They were eating cinnamon rolls. They were also, in Isla's case, doing homework. Isla had recently informed her father that she intended to run the company one day, and Adrian had informed her that she could start by mastering long division. She was working on it. The bell above the door rang. Adrian stepped inside. The bakery paused, not because anyone stopped what they were doing, but because a great many eyes flicked, briefly, and then returned to their work. He walked to the counter. Margaret looked up. Flour on her cheek. Apron over a soft blue dress. Chestnut hair falling out of her bun. She smiled at him, and it was, he thought, the same smile she had given him from the very first moment, on the marble steps of his house, when she had been shaking, and had smiled anyway. "Mr. Vale," she said, teasing. "Miss Rowe," he said, teasing back. He set a small velvet box on the counter. Margaret looked at the box. She looked at him. She looked at the box again. The bakery went very, very quiet. Sophia Rowe, who had been arranging pastries in the display case, straightened up and put a hand over her mouth. Adrian did not kneel. He did not need to. He simply looked at her across the counter, this woman who had walked into his broken house and made it a home without knowing that she had done it, and he spoke. "Margaret Rowe," he said. "When you first came to my door, I did not know what I was missing. I only knew that my house was cold and my children were angry, and I did not know how to warm either of them. You did not fix us. You did something better. You loved us." Loudly, without ever raising your voice. My children have a mother because of you. I have a heart again because of you. There is not a room in my life that is not brighter because you walked into it. I have loved you since the second day, and I would like, if you will let me, to spend every day of the rest of my life proving it. The bakery did not breathe. Margaret's eyes filled. You know, she whispered, you never once said any of that until right now. I know, he said. I am sorry, I am, apparently, a slow learner. She laughed, and she cried at the same time. Yes, she said. Yes, of course, yes. The bakery erupted. Isla stood up from her table and said loudly. Finally. Owen and Otto whooped in unison. Poppy, who had understood only that Maggie was crying and Papa was smiling and this was, therefore, a happy event, launched herself off her chair and ran the length of the bakery and slammed into Margaret's legs and shouted, Mama, Mama, Mama. Margaret bent down, tears streaming, flour on her cheek, and picked her up. Adrian came around the counter and took them both into his arms. Sophia Rowe was sobbing openly. Marco Bianchi, who was standing near the door in his usual suit and who had, only that morning, informed Adrian that if he did not propose today, he was personally going to do it himself, quietly wiped his eyes and pretended he was not. Outside on the sidewalk, a woman walking her small dog stopped and looked in through the window at the scene inside. She saw a large, soft, radiant woman being held by a tall man in a charcoal coat, with 4 children clustered around them. She smiled at the sight. Then she walked on. She did not know that she had just walked past the beginning of a story that everyone who worked in that quiet, careful empire would tell for the rest of their lives, in low voices, over drinks, on the anniversary of the Black Protocol, the only time it had ever been called. She had not been the beauty in the ballroom. She had not been the heiress in the tower. She had been the tired young woman who had rung the doorbell on a cold morning with a shaking hand, because the rent was due, and the bakery was slow, and she had once told her mother that she would keep going, no matter what. And in the end, the man who had every kind of power in the world had used all of it, quietly, only to make sure that she never had to keep going alone again. Because the truth, the real truth, the one that hides behind every story like this one, is that greatness is not measured in what a person owns, or how loudly they speak, or how sharp their features are in a photograph. Greatness is measured in what a person will move mountains for, quietly, without ever being asked. And it is measured, too, in the kind of soul that walks into a cold house full of angry children and does not flinch, does not shrink, does not run, but instead simply kneels down, opens her arms, and lets the smallest child climb in. That is what changed everything. That is what always changes everything. And that, in the end, was why the 27th Nanny had run, and why the 28th had stayed, and why an empire and 4 small hearts, and 1 very quiet man, finally, all at once, learned how to breathe again.